During introductions earlier, I introduced myself. I'm Kate McCarthy. I'm the Sustainable Communities Program Director with BNRC, with Johanna Miller and Keel Corey. So we're going to use these two guides, which we will make available to you, to talk about various tools and resources and really approaches and strategies to building a resilient community.
Do you want me to drive this?
Yeah, you can drive that. But before we do that, we're talking about actions that can be taken at the local level, and many of you are also very active at the regional level. There's a lot going on at the state level as well, as far as how all these things tie together. So,
yeah, just thought, I mean, I think Kate laid it out, but I think, what we're going to be offering you here are some tools that you can work with locally and obviously with your regional planning commission. So energy, planning for energy is more important now than ever, and getting communities to think about planning comprehensively is really important. There are a couple different things I wanted to make sure on your radar. As you probably know, the state has a comprehensive energy plan. Went through a pretty rigorous process. It came up with a very ambitious, but I would argue necessary goal, 90% renewable by 2050. We're never ever going to meet that goal unless we, as you all know, do aggressive conservation, efficiency, transportation reform, land use reform, generation, all pieces of the puzzle. So these tools really aim to get communities to think more broadly about the comprehensive nature of how do we tackle efficiency, or excuse me, how do we tackle energy issues. And then secondly, there are also some, as you probably have been hearing, last year the governor convened the Energy Generation Siting Policy Commission to do, to try and get in front of some of the conversations that are happening and sort of debates or divides on energy generation siting in Vermont. That commission came up with a pretty thoughtful set of recommendations. Unfortunately, as a package, it has not really been acted on. There's an effort afoot in the legislature right now to make some changes to the planning process. I just put that out there to say that energy planning is more important now than ever, and being proactive and engaged in that process and working with your communities. I don't need to talk to you guys about this. I'm talking to the choir, and I think it's wonderful what you're all doing. But that's why, these tools I think are just even more important. Is like, how do we think proactively, come together on solutions and sort of build consensus and move forward toward, the solutions that we ultimately need. So.
Right, and as the speaker was saying earlier, it's his sense that the rate of acceleration is increasing. Is that possible? That our momentum is increasing, and for towns to be able to go along with that and not only shape it, but also support some of the other efforts that are going on by necessity beyond town borders is really quite important. So that's a little bit about where we're coming from today. Next slide, please. The way that I'm going to tackle this is first to talk with you about the Resilient Communities Scorecard, because this covers a lot of topics, not just energy, but also energy-related topics. Land use, where and how we live and how that affects the way we move around. Transportation, the way we move around and the energy that it uses. Natural resource conservation, historic preservation, and on and on. So we're going to start with that because it's a screening tool for helping towns understand their level of resilience in a number of dimensions. And then I'll get a little more specific and talk about this guide. I know you've seen it. It's listed as new on our agenda. It's probably 3 years old now, but it's still incredibly relevant. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some Planning 101 to remind you of the ways that energy committees can really engage in this process in an active way. And then I hope that we'll wrap that all up and have a little bit of time for discussion in terms of any questions that you might have, as well as activities you have underway. If I get going, if I get wound up talking about planning, sometimes I use an unfamiliar term or I'll throw jargon at you. Don't hesitate to stop me. I don't mind being interrupted for that.
That'd be nice.
If I'm guilty, interrupt me. So that you know where we're coming from, I just want to tell you a little bit about VNRC, the Vermont Natural Resources Council. We're over 50 years old, and we were founded by a diverse coalition of people, from farmers and foresters to natural resource professionals to conservationists to state government officials. And we work, next slide please. We work through 4 programs. You've got half of the program director staff with you today. We have, so the 4 programs through which we approach environmentalism and resilience and healthy communities are the Sustainable Communities Program, the Water Program, Forests and Wildlife, and then Energy and Climate Action. And that selection of 4 programs is really a recognition that when everything that we talk about, no matter what we care about, has to do with the interaction of human and natural communities on the landscape. And if we can't figure out how those fit together, we're not going to really have good tonight long-term solutions for either of those groups. We also recognize very much that the economy and the environment go hand in hand. We've got to take care of one if we're going to take care of the other. Okay? We merged, Smart Growth Vermont merged with us in 2011, so the sustainable communities work that we do has a smart growth component to it. And as Joey mentioned earlier, we also coordinate the Vermont Energy and Climate Action Network. So that's just a little bit about where we are coming from. So jumping right into the scorecard. How many of you remember the Smart Growth Scorecard? It looked a little bit like that. Came out over 12 years ago. So that was produced by the Vermont Forum on Sprawl, which later became Smart Growth Vermont. And at that time, you know, in the year 2000, the issues facing Vermont had to do with growth and sprawl and the undermining of our downtowns and our villages. Today's challenges are similar, but we're looking more broadly at what it means to be a strong community, a smart growth community, a resilient place. And so we got a grant to update the scorecard by adding in information about transportation and information about healthy community design. At the same time, the energy program got a grant to do a series of checklists that would help towns figure out where do they stand in terms of energy. And we looked at these 2 projects side by side and we said, really, they're all the same thing. We can't talk about transportation without talking about energy. We can't talk about renewable energy without talking about air quality. And we can't talk about renewable energy without talking about where we put it. So we decided to do an update that led to a combined scorecard. And so that's what we have here today. And that's going to be a theme that, whether you've heard it or not before, it's one that I'll be saying over and over again tonight. All of these decisions and policies about how we use our land and all of the investments, whether in roads or water or schools or renewable energy, they all come together to determine how resilient we are, and they have great impacts on how much energy we use. So that's why I like to talk about it in a not just a multifaceted way, but really a spherical way. This is a 3-dimensional puzzle that we're trying to fit together. Like that. So keep on going. Good. So also, as we developed this Resilient Communities Scorecard, we wanted to talk about resilience broadly instead of just smart growth. And part of that is because of the recognition that we are facing a new normal. Many of you have probably seen this graphic before. The scorecard really tries, again, to acknowledge that interconnectedness and how action on these things that we care about can also help us adapt to and start to mitigate climate change. And we know that this is an issue. We started this scorecard in the fall of 2011, and so we were also coming off of Irene and the spring flooding of 2011. And so as we were talking about adapting to climate change, mitigating climate change, we also realized we wanted to put together a tool that would help towns become more resilient, not just for all the feel-good environmental reasons, but because of the cost savings, because of the practicality that, that towns were going to need to face, especially as we expect to see more of these events in the coming years. So as you go through the scorecard, you'll see climate change and adaptation to it, mitigation of it, as a theme throughout. All right, good. I'll go through this briefly. I like it because it has a cartoon on it. In presenting this, we've put forth a vision for Vermont. What can Vermont be in 2030? It can be compact, walkable communities, diverse transportation options, energy security, and clean local generation, while maintaining our historic resources and open spaces, thriving farms and forests, which help our landscape and our economy, affordable housing so that we can all stay put, and an engaged public who wants to keep being active in that. All right, so I've alluded to some of this. Do we have enough scorecards to pass around? I'm going to send scorecards around. If you already have one, feel free to take another one. If you don't, please take one. But I'll just keep on going while those are making their way around. So what is the scorecard? It's a framework for assessing resilience. It's a series of 12 checklists that contain specific strategic questions. It's really a first step. I consider it a medium course screening tool to help start conversations in your community, whether about downtown development, natural resources, renewable energy siting. And then, we know it's really easy to do this kind of thinking, but then not know what to do next, right? So we've designed this so that it points you towards taking action. So the way that each, take the next slide, I guess. So there are 12 checklists. I won't read through all of these topics, but the gist of it is we're looking really comprehensively at everything in order to understand the full amount of resilience that we have. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of how, before we get into the nitty-gritty, to give you an idea of how this scorecard is set up, I've turned to page 8. And this is the first checklist. It has to do with land use. And at the beginning, we do a little bit of an overview of what the issue itself is. Why do we care about this? What does it do for us? Where are the benefits? And then we go into, we have tips for accurate scoring, for how to answer the questions. Who do you talk to? What do you look at? Do I have to read the town bylaws? Maybe. And then you have this series of questions, and you answer those A, B, C, based on approximately where your community is. And sometimes, in order to get a 3, which is the highest score, the item that we've put is a little bit aspirational. We've done that on purpose because communities are already doing so many good things. We want the scorecard to help communicate what you can do to be doing that much better. So then, when you're done, you tally it up, and there's a blue box at the end of each checklist that puts you in the category of resilient community, in transition, or needs your attention. And based on that, there's a series of actions that you may choose to take. For example, if you're in transition, you may want to examine your zoning to make sure it creates an actual compact town center surrounded by rural countryside. Sometimes we have that aspiration in our town plans, but then our zoning is 1-acre lots in the village. So those things are mismatched. So that's kind of how to use a checklist, just to give you a quick tour. The other thing to know about this guide, any term that's in bold here is defined in the back, in the resources section, which points you towards resources, things that you can look at in order to take that next action step. And also throughout, we've got inspirational pictures from real people who have done these things. And I think Alex Wilson is in here somewhere. Page 28, autographs after the show. So you can see that there are really a lot of good things going on. You've got examples from people who are doing it. You've got ways that you can do it once you've answered the checklist. All right. So just to give you an example of the types of questions that are asked in this checklist. This one's about vibrant town centers. I'll just read it. The question is, does your town plan include specific language that describes a desired pattern of development? If so, what's the language say? Yes, we have it. It includes a town center. We want clustered development near the town center and very low average densities beyond. The plan's not specific, or the plan calls for scattered growth. Next one, please. Another example of a question you'll find in this checklist, or in the transportation checklist, has to do with diverse transportation options. How is your town planned for future streets, paths, or sidewalks? We have a plan. It's a town plan transportation map, or an official map that includes where we want future streets, bike paths, and/or pedestrian paths. Now, we recognize that the scale of planning may or may not be appropriate, depending on the size of the town. Yet we put it as an aspiration. Paths help connectivity too. It doesn't have to be a beautiful sidewalk with a marble curb. In fact, we encourage it not to be. Make it something people really use. Make it something transport. We've begun working on plans for future roads and/or paths, and we have no plan. Those are just a few examples of the different types of questions you'll find within the scorecard. Now, I don't remember exactly how many questions total are in this scorecard. I think there are easily over 60 or 80 questions. So it would be kind of foolish for me to say, go home and work on it, come back next week. We recognize that this is a process, that this is something unlikely to be completed by an individual. It's probably unlikely even that it will be completed by any single group, like just the Planning Commission, or just your Historic Preservation folks, or just your Energy Committee. That's kind of by design. The comprehensiveness of it and the benefit that comes from completing this, I think, has to do in part with communication between those different groups. And so that's where I see energy committees really coming in and bringing a lot of value. The last 3 or 4 checklists are all about energy. And so if you can complete those and then talk with your Planning Commission about the land use and transportation pieces, or your Conservation Commission about the natural and historic preservation pieces, then you start a dialogue in your community, whether it's for your town plan update process or for any other type of process, about where you want to go in the future. And you've got some examples of tasks you can do. You've got some examples of aspirations you might have, and then you can start the hard part, which is prioritizing those tasks and aspirations. Because I love what you said earlier, Tom, about busyitis. Is that what you called it? It was very clever. We've all been there, and we know how enthusiastic everybody is about doing their projects. We also know that there's only so much capacity. So the more tools that a community has to prioritize where they want to go, the better. We really hope that the Resilient Communities Scorecard can be a part of that. If you're not sure where to get started, in the introduction of this guide, on page 3 is a grid with suggested ways to use the scorecard. Whether you're doing town planning, open space planning, energy planning, and investments, even if you're working on your town budget, thinking about how that does or doesn't reinforce or fill in some of the gaps that may have been highlighted by this, can be a very useful exercise. All right. So I'll take a short breath and see, are there any questions from you about this tool before I go on to talking about our next tool? Yeah, Eric.
There seems to me to be a strong disconnect between the philosophy of smart growth of compact villages and the ability of the village to increase growth with limited sewage capacity. And it's my proposition that until we find a way of treating sewage besides adding water to it, we will never achieve the smart growth objectives.
Absolutely. I think that in every meeting that I'm in talking about smart growth, that comes up, that people want to accomplish it, especially locally, but there are obstacles. The first is funding. The second is A&R openness to alternative wastewater systems that really hinder the type of village development we'd like to see. I understand that a third thing being dealt with, particularly in this region, is that there are some new, are they called discharge standards? But basically, if you want to open a pizza joint, then you need to have X gallons of wastewater capacity available according to a state standard, even though you think that your local standard might be a little different because of the traffic. So I'm agreeing with you. And I think that we need to keep talking about smart growth as an aspiration in order to move the ball down the court for the other pieces. It's a really, really hard challenge, and it's something that, like I said, something that comes up at a lot of meetings. Funding is the biggest thing. Willingness to go from individual systems where you have a feeling of control to a shared system that may be cheaper in the long run, that's a huge mental shift as well. So there's a lot at play there.
If I could just add one thing, the Wyndham Regional Commission is also looking in the next few years at doing an assessment for villages in the area to look at water treatment and wastewater systems that are community-wide, and hopefully that will help move this question forward, because there are so many barriers.
The systems are well beyond the financial means of small villages, so the real solution is to stop adding water to your sewage. That's a real game changer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kate, I'm just not clear on how you move forward with the scorecard. Do you see one group using a variety of pulling from a number of committees within the town or a number of groups independent of one another putting together? What have been the sort of best practices?
It depends on your goal. I would say that you can tackle the whole thing if you want to do broad community visioning. I would say that you could do just pieces and parts of it if there are certain things you want to examine. So for example, if you're doing a comprehensive town plan, for example, or visioning process related to the town plan, I would say that the Planning Commission would take this tool and say, Energy Committee, please help us with the last 3 checklists, and Conservation Commission, could you please advise us on these checklists? And then get together and talk about it and what the findings are. This gives scores for each individual section. There's no macro score at the end. And so it really is the start of a conversation rather than, okay, you've got your answer, now do these 3 things. So I think, to answer your question, that there needs to be one person or entity who's going to bring that information together and then translate it into the next step. Did that answer?
Okay, are there communities in Vermont that have gone through this process already?
A little bit. It's been slow to roll out, and that's been partly our fault. But I know that towns are picking it up as they go through their planning process. So, for example, the town of South Hero has a proposal before it for a dollar store to be built, and there's a group of citizens who don't feel that that's a good fit. And so they're trying to zoom out and look and see what their other goals and priorities are. And they may be using the scorecard as part of that discussion when they're saying, okay, well, we want to say no to a dollar store, but we want to say, what do we want to say yes to, and where are we going to put things? So that's one example. The town of Duxbury picked it up when they were doing their town plan. The town of Hartford is interested in it, particularly for some of the energy stuff. But so far, not a huge rollout.
I would also say that East Montpelier used it and
Right.
sort of did it in the way that Kate described, which I think is useful. I think, it's also just meant to be sort of an educational tool. Even at the most basic level, it sort of can be a helpful case-making tool for folks who might be on select boards or planning commissions who, you want to put these issues in the context and the frame that, we think is really important. So that is it at the most basic level. But when, for East Montpelier was going through the update of its municipal plan and did sort of the process that Kate described, which I think was really useful.
Okay, I'll keep on zipping along. So you've gone through this process, you've had a really robust community discussion, and you want to take action, you want to get involved. What's next? Particularly when it comes, so now I'm going to zoom in a little bit to energy. This is where you pick up your energy planning and implementation guidebook for Vermont Communities, April 2011. The benefit of the small print in this guidebook is that there is a lot of very rich information in here about how you, as an energy committee member, can engage in the local planning process. And I'm going to try not to take too much time on this, but I'd like to highlight for you some of the basics of that planning process, which are also found in here, just so we can start, just to kind of spur some discussion about how to get involved in these things. So, next slide. So why planning? A lot of towns, it's something that's done every 5 years. It gets a little tiring. It's routine. But it's really a lot more than that. It's an opportunity for this conversation about community vision. What do you want for the future? That said, planning in Vermont is optional. Towns do not need to adopt a plan, but if they choose to do so, it has to include certain chapters. There are also benefits to adopting a plan. Besides using it as an opportunity to get your community together and talk about what you want, you can write down what you want in the form of goals and policies and actions. The policies, as many of you probably know, town plan policies are referred to in Act 250 review. And one of the requirements of Act 250 is that any given project is in conformance with the town plan. So by engaging in that planning process and having very clear parameters or very, very clear policies, you communicate to the district commission what is and isn't compatible with your town's vision. That's one of the things in Vermont, comprehensive plans are kind of in a funny spot when it comes to that, because on the one hand, they're these wonderful community-oriented visionary documents. On the other hand, they're kind of pseudo-regulatory, and that can be challenging. But if your community's had a really good conversation about what it wants, be very articulate about that and make sure that is considered in the review of regional projects. Now, many of you also know that Act 250's 10 criteria are considered in the so-called Section 248 process, which is the review of electricity distribution and transmission and telecommunications infrastructure. At that point, those policies become a guide for the Public Service Board. It's not mandatory. The 248 processes align with the local policies, but nevertheless, if you don't have anything in your town plan, then there's really no telling the PSC what you want to do. So the other important thing besides engaging in regional review processes is that anything that you're going to do in your town, whether it's change the zoning or create a town forest or do an outreach and educational program, anything you do to implement needs to be laid out in the town plan first. So if it's not written in your town plan, you really shouldn't do it. If you try to change the zoning to, 50-acre conservation districts and you haven't telegraphed that first in your town plan, your zoning can be out of conformance and then illegal. And so that's a really good reason to plan. So that's a little bit about the process overall. Yeah, bring it back up. This is quite small, so I won't spend much time on this slide. But where does energy fit into the municipal plan in Vermont? I mentioned that there are 12 required elements of a municipal plan, and those are basically chapters. And you need a land use chapter, a transportation chapter, and right down through the list, a housing chapter, an economic development chapter. I think there's a child care chapter in there too. There's a wide range of things. But throughout those 12 chapters, there are many opportunities to talk about energy, particularly in the land use section, the transportation section, and the energy section itself. And as you can imagine, there are also opportunities to talk about energy when you talk about, say, community utilities and facilities. What are the energy implications going to be of putting a elementary middle school close to the village versus far away from the village? How does that then tie into community health? How does it tie into busing costs, things like that? And so when you're thinking about energy and where it can go in the town plan, think broadly and don't be shy. I remember there was one plan, I don't recall which one it was, but it used energy as a frame. And so at the beginning of every single plan chapter, it said, here are the energy considerations within this plan, or within, for housing, for natural resources, for historic preservation. This slide's a little out of order. I apologize. It should come a little earlier. But I just wanted to point out that as towns undertake planning, they're not doing it in a vacuum. The state has a series of planning and development goals, and those reinforce the elements that you're supposed to include in your town plan. So we've talked about smart growth. The number one goal of the state, or the first on the list anyway, is to plan development so as to maintain the historic settlement pattern of compact villages and urban centers surrounded by rural countryside. It sounds pretty, and actually I'm in the State House, and I think I hear this every day. Someone will stand up and say, we want the compact rural countryside and work the lands, and it's beautiful. It's not just beautiful, it's also energy efficient. It also increases the likelihood of getting any sort of shared community water and wastewater system. And if it's well designed, it can also provide some really good neighborhoods, places for people to live, shop, eat, work, etc. Next one, please. As far as the energy is concerned, has anyone seen this slide before? I put it into presentations whenever possible. It may be a little hard to read, so I'll just kind of point out what it says. This gets at the interconnection between land use, where we live, energy, and transportation. And it looked at 4 scenarios. A suburban scenario, where people have an average car and an average home in terms of energy usage. A suburban scenario, where people have a LEED, we'll say that it's a LEED certified home, though it's not really done very much. A very efficient home and a very efficient vehicle. And then we have someone living in a more compact area with an average home and an average vehicle, and then someone living in a more compact area with a super green, or a green home and a green vehicle. So what you see going from left to right is that the suburban green, where you have a green home and a green vehicle, still uses more energy than someone who lives in a more compact area with a regular vehicle and a regular leaky home. The best outcome is going to be if you're in a compact area and you've got these technological benefits. The worst outcome is if you live further out. So I always find that to be a very interesting and useful illustration about the importance of location. Location, location, location. All right, next slide, please. Let's skip this one. So, now that I've got you all excited about planning and you're going to go back and join your planning commission, or advise them on your plan, I just want to let you know that when you work on the energy, how many of you have worked on the energy chapter of your municipal plans? Okay, so you should be giving this presentation, honey. I just want to point out that there are actual statutory requirements about what needs to be covered in the energy chapter. They must include an analysis of energy resources, needs, scarcities, costs, and problems within the municipality, so kind of a snapshot of where you are. Statement of policy on energy conservation, statement of policy on development of renewable energy resources, policy on patterns and densities of land use likely to result in the conservation of energy, and then you may address other related issues. So even, we talked about resilience and all of the different things that can go into that. Even in our state statute, which says what planning needs to look like, there is the acknowledgement that there are a number of interconnected issues that affect energy. And your awareness of those as energy committee members, as people who are going to work on this, I think can really help draw out creative solutions from all the people who work on these issues. All right. I'd like to skip the next two slides, and just so that we have a little bit of time for discussion. Get involved in planning. You have insight to bring, you have technical expertise and knowledge. Many of you have already done it, I hope you'll do it again. If you're still contemplating exactly how and where you want to be most effective as an energy committee, I just leave you with these thoughts. The importance of investing in relationship building with your planning commission, your select boards, your school boards, and your homeowners, and your property owners, other property owners as well, and renters, everybody. Those relationships are fundamental not only to getting the word out in a grassroots way, that door-to-door way, but also when it comes to figuring out what your vision for the future is, talking with all those people is important. If you do participate in writing plan chapters, short and sweet is the rule. It's hard to do, but it's important. If you write plan policies, which I hope you will, policies that are clear and unambiguous, policies that say something to the effect of, the town should consider, maybe possibly sometime, considering if it wants to, buying a light bulb that is a CF. The town shall utilize best available electricity efficiency in all public buildings, to the extent feasible, whatever. Last but not least, defining your role as an energy committee. This process that I've just described to you, I've talked a lot about statute, and I've talked a lot about formal established bodies. And I know that some of you are in energy committees that are creatures of your select boards, and some of you are in more independent capacities. So there are benefits to both, and a lot of energy committees, I think, tend toward activism and, no pun intended, energy, and really building that energy on the ground and at the grassroots. So I think that as an energy committee, it's always, and you're all from very sophisticated energy committees from my experience. Nevertheless, it can be worth it to pause and have that conversation about how much do we want to be an activist body and how much do we want to be a group that insinuates itself into these more formal frameworks. There are really a lot of benefits to both. I think that it's possible to do both, especially when you've invested in the relationship building. So no matter how far along you are in your energy committee as a member of that committee or the age of the committee as a whole, these things are worth contemplating so that you can think about what it means to be most effective in your community.
profiled in here and some of the fantastic projects that you've done, because our experience is that the stuff is incredibly wonky and time-consuming. Selling it to the broader public.
It's important but dry, shall we?
Something like that. Anyway, there are case studies, and we actually have an accompanying publication. If you want to get your hands on that, we are happy to send it to you, or it's available for download on the internet. And it's fabulous that you guys have the Wyndham Regional Commission here as a resource and a partner in all of this. I know worked with several other communities that really have used this tool as they're going through their local plan update, and we often can send those, like Waterbury is an example, who really worked closely with their planning commission and select board, and they did a very robust update to the energy element. Those are available to share. So if you want to see other examples of how communities have done it, those are available. I can get them to you.
Sure.
I would just add to that, Joey is well aware, as and I am to an extent, about the different energy projects and initiatives going on around Vermont, particular to energy committees, but if you have an ongoing project or are aware of something developing or have done something, please send that to us. Send us links to news on that. We're always looking for anything we can share, and definitely anything we can learn from a project or experience you guys have been involved in. So that's just a little add-on there.
So with that, I think there's about 5 minutes left in this time slot on the agenda, and I wanted to offer to answer any other questions or hear any feedback on these tools or information about your experiences being involved in these processes, or positive, negative, otherwise. Sort of open to hearing from you, since I've been talking for a long time.
Long before Gumerson had an energy committee, I was on the planning commission for about 12 years and tried to do a bunch of this stuff, more progressive zoning, and it was really frustrating. In fact, I've likened being on the planning commission with ideas like this to the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where the sages are walking along, hitting themselves over the head with the stone tablets and chanting. But we tried to do things like sliding scale zoning that controls both the minimum lot size and maximum lot size in a large subdivision. And that just, it's a neat idea. I really like it. It sort of results in preserving some larger open tracts of land and clustering houses. But it just hit a brick wall, with the property rights advocates. And, cluster housing scares people. I don't quite know why, but they picture, I'm not sure what they picture, but it was a tough challenge, and I'm not sure how different it would be today. That was maybe 20 years ago. We were 15 years ago at least.
I hear you. One answer to that is I think there's been a lot of bad clustering done, bad design. There is possible good design, but it's a little scary in between spaces. My other answer or comment would be I would hope that going through a process like this can help towns think of where they are or might be willing to go. Maybe it's not clustering, but maybe or maybe it's not sliding scale density, but maybe density averaging, for example, is a little bit lighter than that. Or maybe, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but really finding a way, what is the compromise and how does that relate to what you want in the long term? But I hear that challenge very much.
The use of this guy I would think be most appropriate when the town's about to redo their plan. It seems like Brattleboro just recently sort of completed their plan, and I wouldn't see Brattleboro sort of doing this at least right away because they've gone through a lot of the same. So you would sort of agree that it's best time is when you're actually working on your town plan.
Yes, absolutely. I would for this, and to a lesser extent from this. I think that the scorecard can be used to just generate community conversation, whether or not you're headed into a plan update. For example, it may give you ideas for regulatory fixes or solutions like zoning or subdivision bylaws, or non-regulatory ones like conservation or landowner outreach.
For the scorecard, I mean, I know Brattleboro just went through it, and if the plan is so great, you wouldn't want to make improvements to it, you might not want to do anything. But if you want to fill in the gaps and have it be bolder, I mean, this might be a process that you would take on for the next update to look more comprehensively. And then, you know, like to Alex's point, I think it's so much as like communities, and maybe this isn't true for Brattleboro, it seems more idyllic down here, I don't know. But we need case making. We need to understand, you know, select boards and city councils need to understand the costs and other implications of these kinds of strategies. And our hope is this can help make the case and for doing the kinds of progressive planning and actions that are necessary.